Do you know, I was getting drinks with an American friend in a hotel bar recently, and we were talking about when the initial marketing appeared all over Soho for Slave Play for the West End transfer, and it was just all of these posters that said, "Is London ready?" And how her immediate reaction was, no, it is absolutely not. Hard to disagree with that now. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. If you're meeting me today for the first time, my name is Mickey Joe. I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am an independent theatre critic who reviews theatre internationally. I am a content creator here on social media, as well as all of the other apps that you would expect. And for the purposes of today's video, I am also a theatrical pundit, which is to say when something happens in the theatre world, I almost always have an opinion about it, especially where discourse is involved. And my goodness, has there been discourse about today's topic. Needless to say, today we are going to be talking about the recent controversial response to the announcement that the West End transfer of the acclaimed Broadway play Slave Play, written by Jeremy O. Harris, it's going to be at the Noel Coward Theatre later this year, will be hosting a very limited number of blackout performances during its run. Those are performances during which black audience members are invited to attend in a majority or entirely black audience. The idea being that this will afford the freedom to culturally connect with relevant and resonant material, free from the white gaze. And to avoid any Cate Blanchett-esque confusion, that's white gaze G-A-Z-E, not G-A-Y-S, although you can assume in any given London theatre there's plenty of both. Now, ordinarily, I may, in the introductions to these videos, or in the thumbnails and titles of these videos, like tease my response to all of this and first break down both sides of this argument, but this is not an argument that has multiple sides. What it is an authentic and valuable means of audience outreach, of cultivating new theatrical audiences, which I don't need to tell you is really important in the current theatrical climate. Because I don't know if you'd considered this before, but all of the old rich white people who buy the overpriced premium tickets which justify the reduced price of the tickets that you may be buying to go to the theatre, they're gonna die at some point, and we need other people to continue going to the theatre so that the entire theatrical medium doesn't die also. And not only are concepts like Blackout Nights for plays about the black identity written by black playwrights a great concept for cultivating new theatrical audiences, they are also not nearly as big a deal as they are being turned into. This is a huge, shameful, racially motivated overreaction from the British press, and we are going to talk about it in some detail today. And I do try in these videos to be magnanimous and articulate and reasonable and balanced, which is why I'm going to do my best not to swear as I explain why the collective British nation has left their arse hanging out about this one. So let's get into it. If you enjoy today's rant of a video, feel free to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel, click on the notifications, do what you have to. If this one is not necessarily to your taste, we're going to go back to reviewing the majority white created pieces of theatre in the West End and Broadway before too long, so feel free to stay tuned for more of those. Needless to say, when Slave Play does open in the West End later this year, I will hopefully be there on press night. I will hopefully be creating a video review here on my channel. As a white person, I will of course not be attending one of the show's blackout performances because guess what? They aren't for me. And that's fine. Let's talk about why. So this is a story that actually goes back a little bit further than this particular production, but began with this play, because Blackout Nights are a concept which were coined by playwright Jeremy O. Harris when Slave Play was originally produced. As you can read on Blackout Night, that's NITE.com, the concept was birthed by Slave Play playwright Jeremy O. Harris, and the inaugural Blackout Night took place on September 18th, 2019. For the first time in history, all 804 seats of Broadway's Golden Theatre, where Slave Play was performing, were occupied by black identifying audience members in communion, celebration, and recognition of Broadway's rich, diverse, and fraught history of black work. Based on the success of this, Slave Play hosted a second Blackout Night on January 8th, 2020 to bookend its Broadway run. Since then, other blackout events have organically taken hold, and it is the organization's hope and intention that this site, that's blackoutnight.com, inspires, facilitates, and informs future blackout events, and in the words of Harris, that this outreach will snowball into more representation of black bodies, both on stage and off. That last little bit is what I want to talk about first, because when we talk about representation and authenticity and moving forwards in a way that is racially diverse and inclusive and representative, there is on occasion no work being done at all, but in many instances where work is being done, it is performative in the sense that we are seeing black actors on stage, but that is not reflected in the creative teams. It is not reflected backstage. It is certainly not reflected within the power structures that are prevalent within this industry on both sides of the Atlantic. And at this point, I will acknowledge I am a white person and I benefit from an enormity of privilege within this industry. And in making making this video, I remain very conscious of that. What I'm doing here is balancing the fact that this is not my fight, that I am not a spokesperson for this group, that this is not about me, and at the same time that I have a platform here and that this is very much deserving of my advocacy, and so that's what I will be doing. But in any case, everything I've just told you, you can find on the website that I previously mentioned. I want to circle back to what they talked about happening at the first Blackout Night, which was that this was Black identifying audience members in communion, celebration, and recognition of Broadway's rich, diverse, and fraught history of Black work. And this is another balancing act. What we are balancing here, or what that community is balancing, I should say, is communion and celebration and enjoyment and entertainment with a recognition of these sort of heavier ideas of this fraught history. And from that perspective, the idea of the Blackout Night becomes two different things. It becomes freedom to express joyously and celebrate, and also freedom to understand, and the freedom of a shared knowledge and weight. So that's what happened on Broadway, and from a very brief amount of research, I can't tell that it caused any major controversy. Anyone who was conscious of this at the time, please let me know in the comments what the response was to this, because obviously if you Google it now, all you get is the enormous British noise that is happening. I should say as well, before we even get to that part of the video, if anyone thinks I'm being overdramatic about this, our Prime Minister has weighed in on this. And considering the uphill battle that is getting him to acknowledge or talk about anything, that's astonishing. So let's talk about how this was actually achieved on Broadway. Both of those performances were taken off sale, and they were private, invitation-only performances. The show's PR firm, promoters, and non-profit partners subsequently reached out to the relevant groups and individuals, especially prioritizing those who may not have been able to afford to attend these performances otherwise. In terms of the legal implications of all of this, they did not prevent or preclude anyone from attending the Blackout performances, and while the intention was to create a space for as many Black identifying audience members as possible, nobody was turned away. And like we then touched on before, this then subsequently became something that took place at different productions. So Daddy, which was another play by Jeremy O. Harris, which was produced at the Almeida Theatre here in London a couple of years ago, held a Blackout performance on April 12th, 2022. Again, I do not remember a furore or a controversy. It was the Almeida, which is further afield. It's a smaller, sort of artsier, highbrow off-West End venue in Islington. It's not the central West End. Also in 2022, Long Day's Journey into Night held one in New York. We then have performances of other productions in Massachusetts, in Cambridge, in Boston, and many others that aren't listed here. In fact, a fun footnote to this entire conversation is that while this rage was burning about all of this on social media, nobody had even noticed the fact that the play Samuel Takes a Break was holding a Blackout performance on February 28th. Literally last week, and guess what? Nobody cared. And yet, among those subsequent Blackout performances, there is another one that did catch a little bit of heat, which was last year, the play Tambo and Bones. This was at the Theatre Royal Stratford East, and this, in May of 2023, invoked a lot of similar debate and knee-jerk reactions. Needless to say, these are being implemented in plays which are about race and specifically about Black culture. That's an aspect of this conversation I think we ought to be highlighting that is getting missed in this conversation. Like, no one is suggesting currently a Blackout performance of Mary Poppins. That's just not happening. But it doesn't seem that far-fetched that a play called Slave Play, or Tambo and Bones, would be hosting one. Come on now. I would actually argue that if there was to be a Blackout Night at Mary Poppins, that would also be fine and valid and a good thing, but we're going to get to that part of the conversation. Also, I can already hear you typing about how plays that explore white culture should have white-only nights, and let's just be real with ourselves and acknowledge that white culture is not a thing. So you can go ahead and hit backspace on that one right now, because we don't need to have that conversation. So flash forwards to this year. It is announced that Slave Play is coming to the West End and that they will be holding Blackout performances. Let's get the exact number of Blackout performances that they're planning and how long the run is going to be. Slave Play is set to run from the 29th of June to the 21st of September, which is just under 3 months, right? July, August, and then not quite all of September, during which time they are planning to host an enormous quantity of Black-only performances. Two whole evenings. Can you imagine? These, if anyone is intrigued, are confirmed to be taking place on the 17th of July and the 17th of September. And once again, it's worth pointing out that no one will be prevented or precluded from attending any performance of slave play. So immediately, any think piece that you've seen or any conversation that's been had around the idea that white people are being barred from the theatre, barred from seeing this show, is factually not true. No one is being prevented from seeing this show. Black audience members are being encouraged to see it specifically on those evenings, as well as throughout the run as well. The word apartheid has been used bafflingly in the notion that this is segregating audience members, but that would imply that black people are being discouraged from seeing it every other night of the run, which is absolutely not the case. Therefore, it isn't segregation, it is just making space. So let's get into it then. We've explained what is actually happening here. Let's talk about my thoughts in response to this. Obviously, segregation is a bad thing. Obviously, apartheid is a terrible thing. That is conclusively not what is happening here. And I dare say that those of you who understand this already understand this, and those of you who don't understand this are going to take a little bit more convincing. So I'm going to illustrate some slightly reductive parallels. Bear with me, because the concept of black theatre on a large stage is still quite a new one in the UK, for honestly no good reason, but one thing we do understand very well is pantomime. And during the run of most pantomimes, they will host schools performances. Sometimes these are on sale and you can book to go and see one, but sometimes they are off sale because they are reserved for schools groups. Do people get up in arms about the fact that they, non-school audience members, can't go and see schools-only performances? No, they don't. Why? Maybe because it's not about race. In fact, there are other pantomimes that in their post-Christmas performances will host the occasional adults-only night where the improv and the jokes can go a little bit further and be a little bit racier. Do people get up in arms about not being able to bring kids to those? I mean, maybe some people do, but for the most part, no. That's not getting debated on British breakfast television. That's not being written about in newspapers. And I think it's because we're willing to understand the value of those and who they are for. We understand the value and the benefit of a schools-only performance. We understand the value and benefit of an adults-only pantomime evening. And so this only seems controversial when you strip it of its value and you don't allow yourself a second to expand your mind and consider that for a culture and a race different to your own, this could be valuable. And I have other examples about this because we could talk about relaxed, accessible performances, which are performances in which various different accommodations are made in order to facilitate, just like I said, more relaxed performances. These are not regularly scheduled. Goodness knows they are not regular enough. But things that will happen at these include like the lighting being less dim and sort of a lot of the elements of the show being less overwhelming, a little less loud perhaps. Characters will come on stage at the beginning to introduce themselves, to explain who they are. All of which, neurotypical people watching this video, may sound like it's not something that would benefit your theatrical experience. But again, it's not for you, it's not for me, it's not for us, it's for the people who will benefit from it. And again, you don't have to personally understand that benefit to acknowledge that it exists. And those are just the examples that already have some kind of a specific classification. There are plenty of shows that imply a particular type of audience. Magic Mike Live in London, for example, is probably more geared towards people who find men attractive. If you're not part of that group and you want to go and see that show for whatever reason, it's not going to exclude you, but it doesn't feel as much geared towards you. I'm thinking of so many things as I'm talking about this. I'm thinking about Fairview that I saw at the Young Vic that had this amazing coup de theatre ending where the audience was asked to physically transplant themselves onto the stage in order to make space for the play's black characters, and this was met with actual heckling from white audience members. I'm thinking about the occasions when kinship and community and shared understanding in an audience has been valuable to me. I went to go and see The Inheritance on the World AIDS Day performance, and me, a very antisocial audience member, struck up conversations with people sat nearby to me who had a huge personal connection to the AIDS epidemic. And like I said, these are increasingly reductive examples. If you want a really frivolous one, Titanic in New York is much more fun if you see it with a bunch of gay men. All of which is to say that being an audience member is not an individual thing. You are part of a community and you are part of an act of communion. And the dynamics of that are going to matter. More could absolutely be said about the specificity of the value of getting to watch a play about the Black cultural experience as a Black person without the white gaze. I'm not the person to speak on that specifically. Jeremy O. Harris has personally been very eloquent about it. And one of my favourite things that he has said in all of this, going back to that idea of outreach and engaging new audience members, because like I said, the old rich white people with the premium tickets are going to die eventually. Sorry to the old rich white people if you're watching this video, you are a valuable part of the ecosystem, but we do need to be thinking about the future. He used a phrase called radical invitation about how it was important to radically invite people into a space and how this would encourage Black audience members who didn't necessarily go to the theatre often or perhaps at all to go and attend this. It is a very absolute kind of a welcome. It is a clear beckoning. And there is value in that. There is so much value in that. I was so overjoyed by that phrase, radical invitation. Unfortunately, if you Google it, you do get a lot of biblical things and like really exciting children's birthday card templates. But it's something I'm going to be talking about a lot because I get asked about curating new musical theatre audiences. As someone who is situated on social media, I think I inherently, when I make videos like this, it's an act of outreach. Posting about shows on Instagram is an act of outreach. It's an act of marketing and publicity. Last year I was invited to speak on a panel about curating the next generation of musical theatre audiences at the Beam New Musical Theatre Writing Conference in Oxford, and radical invitation sums up brilliantly something that I think is really important to that. Now you might be asking, why do people care this much now? If they didn't care about half of the other Blackout Nights that I mentioned, why is this causing an uproar? And I think unfortunately it's just caught enough fire that people are now paying attention to it from all of the worst corners of the internet. We also live in a time when outlets see this and understand that it's going to get clicks and outrage and stoke the fires of a culture war, which I think for the record is not only lazy clickbait journalism, but is also actively harmful to already marginalized communities. But the other thing to consider is that this is a play happening in the West End, which is a place where a lot of white audience members feel like they have autonomy and access to. We could also call that an entitlement. Additionally, one member of the UK cast of this production will be TV's Kit Harington. You may know him as Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. I know him as Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, who I also then saw in Jamie Lloyd's revival of Dr. Faustus down the street at the Duke of York's Theatre. And I'm probably as excited about Kit Harington being in this play as everyone else is. I'm particularly excited about all of the American actors who are joining the West End run reprising their roles from Broadway. That's very exciting to me. And yet somehow, and without tooting my own horn too much here, I am managing to contain all of that excitement without it bubbling into a rage that there are 2 nights during this 13-week run that I ought not to attend. So I told you that the British press had been losing their minds about this. Let's look at one such example, because there have been TV interviews and there have been think pieces and there has been just 1,000,001 tweets about this and about how it's racially divisive and how it's exclusionary and reverse racism and all of this nonsense. The majority of which I'm not going to entertain, but we will read a little bit of what's been written about it. I will say that we in Britain don't acknowledge slavery particularly well, not in my experience at least. We learn about the abolition of slavery in schools. I don't know that we really spend enough time looking at its origins. And I just think that in all sorts of media, not just in theatre, but the US does a much better job of having difficult conversations around slavery and just acknowledging that slavery happened. And even recently, in trying to get rid of building names and statues of former slavers, the UK is very resistant to this because, slavery famously had nothing to do with the British. And if you can believe it, the flames of this culture war got fanned so much that the proverbial beacons of Gondor blazed all the way to Downing Street, where British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak decided that he was going to be useful this week and chime in. Sunak's official spokesperson said it was concerning that the Noel Coward Theatre in the West End plans to hold what it dubs blackout performances performances during a 2-month run of Slave Play, a Broadway production about race and sexuality, which will demonstrably run for longer than 2 months. This idea is not new and has taken place before in the UK, with theatres in London holding such performances for Daddy by Jeremy O. Harris, who also wrote Slave Play, and Tambo and Bones by the US playwright Dave Harris. The spokesperson said, "The Prime Minister is a big supporter of the arts, and he believes that the arts should be inclusive and open to everyone, particularly where those arts venues are in receipt of public funding. Obviously, these reports are concerning and further information is being sought, but clearly restricting audiences on the basis of race would be wrong and divisive. It's a statement of principle that clearly the arts should be inclusive, and I think that particular taxpayers would particularly expect that to be the case when public funding is involved." I'm so curious about what you mean by particular taxpayers here. Do you mean white ones? Is that what you're actually trying to say? Also, if we can just fact check this all the way back to the beginning, the show itself is of course inclusive and open to everyone, because these are only 2 performances as part of a 13-week run, which will be blackout performances. And in response to the idea of restricting audiences on the basis of race, that is not what's happening here, because these are just 2 performances where an all-black audience is being curated or being encouraged to attend or being radically invited. And again, there were no thinly veiled threats regarding taxpayer funding when pantos were hosting schools-only performances, when West End shows are having relaxed performances. Beyond the theatre industry, we understand the concept of like an under-18s night. We understand the concept of a ladies' night. Why is it that when race is a factor, and specifically when it's the black community, that suddenly that has to be exclusionary, that suddenly they're not entitled to a private space, they're not entitled to an evening which might cater towards them, because the theatre especially is somewhere where white audiences are so used to being catered to for centuries now. Also, should somebody make Rishi Sunak and the government aware of the fact that the Noel Coward Theatre does not receive public funding because it isn't the National, it isn't an NPO, it also isn't a producing house. The Noel Coward Theatre aren't putting on this show because that's not how this works. They're not a venue like Theatre Royal Stratford East that produce their own shows. This is a Delphont Mackintosh run theatre that is receiving the West End transfer of Slave Play, that is being produced by people who I don't believe are in receipt of public funding. And even if they were, this was such an opportunity to celebrate outreach from a British Prime Minister who, if you have no idea, I hasten to point out to you, is not white, but who would probably really enjoy the second act of The King and I, currently running at the Dominion Theatre for reasons that will be obvious to some of you. It's just so disappointing and sadly unsurprising to see this being the reaction, to see Jeremy O. Harris having to respond to these vile tweets, to see our Prime Minister weighing in on this to the extent that Jeremy O. Harris has to quote tweet this to tell him to grow up, as he absolutely should. To see people who have no interest in the theatre, who have no awareness of the theatre, who, like with other blackout performances that have been happening while this is going on, would not have known about this unless all of the worst outlets imaginable had brought it to their racist attention. To see them planning boycotts that were never going to matter to this production because they weren't going to get tickets, and Kit Harington's in it, so it's probably going to sell pretty well, honestly. To see them planning protests and all sorts of nonsense. The whole thing has just received this utterly ridiculous response that I have no patience for whatsoever. Which is not to say I haven't enjoyed some of the tweets, because Nick Curtis, who you may remember in my last review roundup video, was a little bit harsh on Hadestown, and I was more than a little bit critical of his thoughts in response to that. He did have a beautifully short response to the Guardian article about Rishi Sunak condemning the Blackout Nights, in which he simply tweeted, "Oh, off." That I thought was very well put. Also, and this is completely unrelated, but some of the criticism that has been levelled against this is that it's not as inclusive as it purports to be, and, you know, where is the inclusivity for people from poorer working class backgrounds? Slave Play also has an initiative where they will be releasing 30 tickets for £1 and above for each performance the following week. So even though this is a play where race, and specifically the black identity, is a big factor, what we are seeing here is radical invitation on multiple different fronts. Again, this is something to be celebrated, not something to be turned into this pointless culture war for people who do not care about the theatre any day of the week. I'm furious. Let me finish by telling you exactly what it was that Jeremy O. Harris had to say to Rishi Sunak. On the 29th of February, Jeremy O. Harris shared this. In a slight rage over the moral panic that a certain aspect of the British public have frothed up around Blackout Nights, 2 nights out of over 100 that have seen audience members of all race in attendance over the last 4 years since its inception on Broadway. To know that your Prime Minister was called upon to discuss this weeks after he said he wouldn't endorse a ceasefire is inconceivable. Grow up. This has happened in NYC, LA, and London. Yes, already happened in London, to great acclaim. And you didn't notice because you didn't care. The portion of the population making this a moment of some sort of moral outrage are the same portion who barely engage with culture because to engage in it would challenge your anxious attachment to a past you never experienced but idealize. Speak on it. I make my work for the now and people of it. People who want to see the audience around them look like the people in their neighbourhood or from their tube ride. That only happens with things like Blackout Nights, £1 ticket offers, and direct communication with young people. If this upsets you, kick rocks. And given that there is absolutely nothing else that I need to add to that, I would suggest that anyone else who is similarly enraged about this go and buy tickets to Slave Play. Now, I do invite responses in the comments section. In the past, whenever I have talked about issues around identity like this, it does invite a certain quantity of people who are not regular viewers, who are not subscribers to these videos, who are not theatre people, who like to come in and bring a certain sort of a racist angle to the debate. And I am unashamed to say I will be moderating the comments section to try and keep everything respectful. I encourage you all not to do the emotional labour of trying to personally contend with any of that. At the same time, this is a nuanced issue and I am genuinely curious to hear other people's perspectives on it. But if we could do that in a specifically non-racist way, that would be fantastic. In any case, those have been my thoughts, that has been the news, and I'm going to go and drink an enormous glass of wine. I hope that you've enjoyed. Make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for more theatre videos coming soon, but more importantly, go buy tickets to Slave Play, go buy tickets to other plays written by black playwrights, featuring black performers, go and see black theatre, go and see black art, and perhaps make sure you're registered to vote. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!